Welcome to episode 34 of School Librarians United. I am your host, Amy Herman. This podcast is dedicated to the issues and challenges school librarians face every day. As a school librarian for 12 years and counting, I found myself asking the question, where's the podcast that will help me do my job? I wanted a podcast which addressed the nuts and bolts of running a successful library program. I don't claim to have the answers, but I hope that this is a platform to share resources and exchange ideas. Now is a perfect time to mention that the ideas expressed in this podcast are my own and do not reflect those of my district. When incorporating research, I always cite my sources. So whether you are a novice or a veteran school librarian, this podcast has something for you. I would like to first extend a very special welcome this week to a handful of listeners who really made my day. Thank you to Librarian Twitter for Colleen in Harleysburg, Pennsylvania, Deborah in South San Francisco. Deborah and I actually have something in common, and that is we work in school libraries in elementary schools where we ourselves attended. Deborah appreciated the podcast for its timeliness, and that is something I really try to schedule. My goal is to be both relevant and evergreen. Evergreen episodes are ones which stand the test of time and are useful to listeners irrespective of when the episodes are downloaded and enjoyed. Listener Kimberly Butcher of Roseville, California, mentioned that she's powered through all of my past episodes and needed to return to get the links and the resources mentioned in the show notes. This is a really helpful tip, that if you're listening to an episode, know that I always attach the links in the show notes to all of the resources mentioned, including every article, website, and book I reference. I will be looking to include transcripts starting in the second season. Mari, who works in an elementary library in California, first emailed the podcast in January, and her feedback and insight has really helped direct the focus of the episodes this past winter. She had a terrific idea, and I'll be sure to share some photos in the show notes. To recognize the 100% book returns her classes had earned, she created lollipop trees using styrofoam shapes, which were then spray painted gold. After sticking the lollipops all over the cones, she attached a label and presented these edible awards to the classes during the end of the year awards ceremony for the entire school. Coinciding with this assembly is absolutely genius. Anytime we can showcase the library and institute a tradition like this is a win for our program. Getting books back at the end of the year is a thankless and time-consuming challenge, and any cooperation and goodwill we can garner from the teachers is going to produce positive results. Brooke in Macon, Georgia, will be starting her first year in an elementary school library on a fixed schedule, and she has also listened to all the past episodes. And Brooke wrote that she would, quote, welcome any words of wisdom you have for me as a beginner. Not sure of your plans for episodes over the summer, but I am sure as the beginning of the new school year nears, the newcomers to the profession like me would welcome an episode focused on new librarians giving advice as far as what to know, expect, how to prepare beyond our formal training, tips, cautions, etc. I'm telling you, when listeners write, this is an absolute gift because instead of wondering how I'm going to start season 2, I already know. Season number 2's first episode will be sometime in August, and it'll be titled Advice for a First-Year School Librarian, What I Wish I Knew. I'll be sure to let listeners know because what I'd like to do is have listeners be able to leave a speak pipe message, and that's sort of a voicemail message we can incorporate into the podcast. I think that would be a lot of fun. So I'm going to work on that. As for recording in the summer, I will be attending ITSE in late June and Nerd Camp in early July, and this will give me a perfect excuse to extend my recording through at least the first week of July. Most likely I will take most of July and August off. I can't say precisely when season 2 will start, but I can say that I do have a lot of episodes lined up, and I honestly don't see an end in sight. I hadn't expected to revisit weeding in season 1. My inaugural episode was in fact about weeding, the librarian's dirty little secret, and it was recorded on August 27th. I appreciate that when I tackle an issue so fundamental to our jobs, that a single podcast episode cannot possibly do it justice. It became clear, however, as I spent more time on school librarian discussion groups on Facebook, that weeding is something we all agonize over. We all second-guess our decisions, and to some extent, regardless of our years of experience and familiarity with our collection. In the spirit of being a lifelong learner, I want to take a second stab at the topic of weeding. I feel this insight could be useful, and it certainly helped me as I contemplate the challenges I'll be facing in the upcoming school year. My first episode on weeding looked at some of the implications of weeding, like pushback from school community, and the formulas such as CREW, C-R-E-W, and MUSTIE, M-U-S-T-I-E, to guide our weeding efforts, and the timing of when weeding should happen. If you haven't listened to my first episode of my podcast, I will say this: appreciate it as a first effort. There's always going to be room for improvement. This episode, Extreme Weeding, will address the scale of this undertaking as well as the approach taken by the school librarian, from a limited scale and a cautious one versus one that's more far-reaching and which can at times seem rather brutal or fearless. When I learn about fearless weeding, it's often accompanied by a set of circumstances which necessitates a reduction in the collection. Weeding is extremely beneficial when the entire collection is being inventoried or relocated due to renovations, carpet installation, or new shelves, or perhaps asbestos abatement. Years before I was hired, my current library's square footage lost approximately a quarter of its shelving space to accommodate a second computer lab for the school. When this happened, a subwall was installed and the shelves were repositioned. What should have happened was the collection should have been weeded at that time. Unfortunately, the ousted bookcases were simply squeezed in even closer rather than reducing the number of books held in the collection, making it very challenging to maneuver between the aisles. Not to put too fine a point on it, but if I crouch down to reach a book on the bottom shelf, no one can get past me because I take up the entire aisle. Finally, extreme weeding is essential in the case of my district because we have school closures coming up. There will be 2 of our 9 elementary schools closed, and this announcement will come at the end of June. In all of these circumstances, extreme weeding is necessary. It doesn't make sense to box up books and distribute them to other schools only to discover that these books should have been weeded years ago. 7 years ago, my family and I prepared to sell our house and move to another. In order to keep expenses down, and because we were moving to a house that was just 2 miles away, we did a great deal of the moving ourselves. I held 3 garage sales in the span of 18 months and acquired something I refer to as garage sale eyes. This means that suddenly I looked at all of our personal belongings very differently. Not just the obvious items that we could do without, but I looked at everything as a potential to be sold. As many discover after holding a garage sale of their own, rarely do we regret anything we sold that day, and more often we can hardly recollect what was sold, unless of course we're paging through photos of our old house. My point is that I'm suggesting in order for extreme weeding to happen, we all need to have on our garage sale eyes. Everything in our collection can and should be questioned. When I posed this idea of extreme weeding on Facebook, Michelle in Washington replied with a very thorough response, and I do appreciate the time that she took to get back to me. Michelle said, "I have extreme weeded 4 aged library collections. Usually when beginning, I weed with a mostly heavy hand, but will hold on to books I am unsure of as I get to know the patrons. Then, at the end of the school year, I go back and I weed each section again fearlessly. Less is more, less provides greater access. Without fail, each time I extreme weed, my students ask, 'Where are all these great new books come from?' I tell them that they have always been there, but now you can see them. The craziest year I had was weeding 10,000 books from a second-store high school library, taking the books down the elevators and throwing them in the back of 2 semis. This year, Michelle continues, I have weeded about 4,000 books from my newly inherited elementary library. As I weed each section, circulation increases immediately in that area. Weed for increased access, weed for increased inquiry. And finally, Michelle said, the school library isn't a book warehouse or a museum. The library should be patron-focused, not book-focused. I really can't thank Michelle enough because those sentiments are really valuable, and getting her personal input really does lend some weight to this argument that extreme weeding is possible. It isn't always pleasant, but it is definitely necessary. I did, and this is Amy, without realizing it, very early in my library career, fearlessly weed my own library. My first library had originally been used as a junior high school. Once the new junior high school's construction was completed, from what I could tell, the old library's nonfiction section was left largely intact, and the brand new junior high library started fresh from scratch. This would explain all the junior high school stamps on the insides of many of my books when I walked into my elementary library. There are many advantages to housing an elementary school in a former junior high. Space for one. However, expecting my elementary students to benefit from books they left behind was not, despite whatever well-intentions there may have been, a good idea. There was something incredibly freeing about weeding those books. I came in over the summer and was able to take advantage of the dumpster, which was behind the school. Rows of windows look out over the parking lot would have, during the school year, enabled entire classes to see the librarian tossing books into the dumpster, but not in the middle of July. Coming into a library for the first time, unless it happens to be brand new construction, is like walking into a huge time capsule. Nowhere else, except perhaps the gym, does everything acquired during the tenure of those who worked in that space remain intact long after they've left. Think about it. When teachers move out of a classroom, they pack up everything for their new classroom. In the event they are retiring, it isn't unusual for them to gift belongings like special furniture or classroom library or resources to teachers in their building. But when a teacher enters a room for the first time, the desk is empty, the cabinets, the cupboards, the storage spaces are all empty, the shelves in the room are empty, and the closet is empty. Without exception, every library has been a time capsule experience for me. For better or worse, every storage space, cabinet, and cupboard was filled with accumulated book processing items, card catalog cards, long-forgotten items, abandoned decorations, bulletin board items, files, receipts, inventories, invoices, and all sorts of surprises. The library collection is also a time capsule, reflecting the purchasing priorities of every librarian who has ever worked in that space. It isn't hard to discern the principles which guided the decision-making years, and it is also easy to see which authors and series were popular, maybe not now, but they might have been. While my examples will be ones that you would find in an elementary library, I'm sure it wouldn't be hard to generate a comparable list for the middle school and the high school library collections. I'm talking about books and authors which are contemporary classics and have remained on the shelves due more to a librarian's protective and sentimental reasons rather than because our students today love reading those books. This point was made by Alexa Newman in her article, A Passion for Weeding, which was posted on the ALSC blog on October 25, 2016. When weeding fiction, Alexa said, quote, "It's subjective, it's emotional. We form attachments to books that can't be analyzed in reports. One of the biggest quagmires is nostalgia. We tend to hang on to books that we loved as children," end quote. I will confess here and now, nostalgia is what keeps Babar on my shelves, Madeline on my shelves, and I am telling you, the day I weed Bread and Jam for Francis by Russell and Lillian Hoban is the day that book comes home in my bag and will sit on my bookshelf until I have grandchildren of my own. Granted, each library is different, and some of these titles and authors will have fans in your schools, but not in others. And I'm not suggesting that all of these books should be weeded. What I am saying is we have lots of these books on the shelf, and until recently, I had never questioned their place in our collection. At one point, I had 15 or more Amelia Bedelia books, Mark Brown's Arthur picture books, as well as the chapter books, at least 25 of them, 15 to 20 Clifford books, the Berenstain Bears, I think every book they ever wrote, every single book, it seems, that was written and illustrated by Tommy DePaula, the entire set of Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys books, the Boxcar Children, the entire set, and Beverly Cleary's books, 2 to 3 copies of each one. I must say that I have missed Patricia Polacco's heyday, but my predecessors made sure that we had 20 to 30 of her books in every library I've ever worked. And I mean no disrespect. Patricia Polacco has authored and illustrated over 100 books and has received many awards for her contributions to children's literature. However, when I can count on one hand the number of times I've checked out any of the aforementioned books in 12 years, I'm telling you, it is time to make some difficult decisions. I can honestly say that for years, and even to a considerable extent today, I have had blinders on when it comes to weeding. There have been corners and pockets of my collection untouched because I didn't question their right to exist quietly, collecting dust on the shelf. There are, of course, options for these dust collectors other than weeding. The easiest and most immediate strategy is to showcase these books on a special display or on top of a bookcase right at eye level, so when students come in for visits, they can see them. Just as importantly, I make sure that these displays are ready and filled with lots of books to display when the staff comes up for our Monday morning meetings. Another way to push long-forgotten titles is to incorporate them into a lesson. When I teach lower elementary to identify the parts of a book or to identify the parts of a story, I'll use these books to see if I can spark interest. There are lots of advantages to using lesser-known authors and their titles for story time, not the least of which is you don't have the kids clamoring to tell you that they all have that book at their house and they've already read it many times. Another reason why I really enjoy reading lesser-known titles is because, and this is true regardless of the age of your students, the students are more likely to be an attentive audience. Kids get fidgety when they already know how the story ends. In the end, if these types of interventions don't increase circulation, then seriously consider them as candidates for weeding. Another book which has been allowed to languish on my shelves despite regular weeding are the older award winners. My libraries have consistently used award-winning spine labels for both fiction and picture books. This means I can, at a glance, see which books are award winners. Until recently, these have all gotten a free pass. If you've ever watched the TV show Survivor, it's a lot like a contestant who wins immunity from being voted off the island. Award-winning books, at least for me, had some immunity when it came to weeding, regardless if they had circulated at all in the past few years. And that shouldn't be the case. This sentiment is echoed by Holly Hibner, who, along with her coworker Mary Kelly, make up the Awful Library Books team. This blog post from October 28th, 2018, written by Holly, was titled, "But It Was an Award Winner," and I'll include a link to their website in the show notes. I had the pleasure of attending a presentation last fall given by Holly and Mary, and I encourage you to spend some time appreciating Mary and Holly's informative and hilarious effort to educate librarians of all types about the importance of weeding because, as their mantra goes, quote, "hoarding is not collection development," end quote. Holly Hibner and Mary Kelly did a thorough Q&A, which resulted in a terrific read titled 7 Answers to 7 Weeding Questions, published on July 21st, 2017. I'll post a link in the show notes. They raised some really interesting, thought-provoking issues. Is your effort to weed being thwarted by staff and administrators? As I suggested in my first weeding episode, as well as the follow-up episode on discarding, non-librarians have a very difficult time understanding why weeding our libraries has to happen at all. Something I suppose I am aware of, but I hadn't given much thought to, is how my collection would be regarded without having the entire canon of children's literature available on my shelves. If I weeded these books, would my library somehow seem inadequate to service the needs of my building? What caught my attention, however, in this article was question number 5. Should we reconsider the necessity of our reference collections and nonfiction? Oh, this is big. I have recently opened my garage sale eyes, and after posting photos of my reference section with visible dust gathering on the tops of every single book, I decided to severely limit my reference collection. I removed the 12 copies each of Merriam-Webster's Biographical Dictionary and Merriam-Webster's Geographical Dictionary. Also found in my reference section, which are no longer there, are the incredibly popular coffee table-sized books, which were a result of the changing of the millennium. So in 1999, there were many books that were the 2,000 years history of this and the 2,000 year history of that. So I have a handful of former reference books, which I did decide to keep and will interfile in my nonfiction collection. The rest were summarily deleted, and digital resources will replace the need to have any of those on the shelves. Maybe 10 years ago, I would regularly purchase a set of student almanacs published by National Geographic. These glossy pages and eye-catching photos and graphics were engaging and made for a fun scavenger hunt with my upper elementary students. Those lessons have all been replaced with database lessons, and I've happily found another use for the $500 I no longer need to spend. 4 years ago, I petitioned my PTO for $1,000 for a set of 50 state books for my 4th graders and their annual research assignment, which is done in their classrooms. I would wheel the set down and position it on a cart between the 2 4th grade rooms, and occasionally a tug-of-war would ensue. Several books were lost, New Jersey and California, and because these books weren't actually checked out to individual students or their teacher, I would have to pay for those titles out of my budget. Instead, something terrific happened. Michigan Electronic Library, also known in Michigan as MEL, a taxpayer-funded initiative, provides many databases and online encyclopedia to everyone, including EBSCO ebooks. And I now have not 1, but 3 state sets online. This year, neither of the 4th grade teachers requested that the 50 state set be brought to their room. I consider this a victory. Accessibility to ebooks from EBSCO has freed up funds that I would have spent on nonfiction, including the country books, which my 5th graders have been using on their Country Expo projects. In fact, if you take a look at my current reference section, it includes 2 encyclopedia sets, neither of which I purchased. They were donated to the school libraries when the public library replaces their copies. And I also have a set of dictionaries. And I realized that the only reason I have these books in my reference set is because I use them for my sub-lesson plans. I don't take many days off. In fact, usually I'm only taking a day off to attend a conference or do a presentation. But when I do, I have to leave lesson plans for my substitutes. And it's really easy to leave a scavenger hunt in a set of dictionaries or a scavenger hunt in a set of encyclopedias for my grades 2 through 5. And this is the only reason why those books are on the shelf today. And I really don't know, but at some point, I think I just have to let go of them. Thanks to the Chromebook carts and databases, my lessons on digital resources have become more valued by my teachers and something akin to hero status by the students who realize just how much information they can access regardless of where they're doing their research. Another helpful article about extreme weeding, which I found when putting together this episode, was April Wittenveen's post on July 13th, 2018, titled Winning at Weeding on the School Library Journal website, and I'll attach a link in the show notes. She begins by quoting Vanessa Calhoun, a library media specialist in Durham, North Carolina, who said, quote, "If your shelves are full, kids aren't reading. Libraries are not book museums." End quote. I stumbled on a really fascinating resource and one I'm planning to revisit once the school year has ended. It's the New York City Department of Education School Library Guidebook, specifically the webpage devoted to weeding. I've included a link in the show notes. The New York City public school system is the largest in the nation, serving just shy of 1 million students every year. Given the sheer number of school librarians and school libraries in the New York City public school system, I am intrigued by this guidebook. This resource alone will give you lots of links and recommendations for weeding done at any scale at your library. I highly recommend a podcast episode called Weeding is Fundamental, which was created by the podcast 99% Invisible. While the story focuses on extreme weeding efforts by public librarians in San Francisco following an earthquake, listening to this topic being addressed by non-librarians is truly fantastic. Be sure to listen also to the bonus add-on, which is a tribute to the Packhorse librarians of Eastern Kentucky. This segment is reason enough to tune in, and I'll include a link in the show notes. I want to welcome you and all listeners to reach out with your feedback and episode suggestions either on Facebook or Twitter or using the email address schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com. If you include your mailing address, I'll be sure to send you a podcast sticker. I want to thank you for listening today. If you found listening to this episode helpful in any way, consider listening to other episodes in the podcast or even subscribing. Also consider sharing this episode with other librarians in your district or your PLN. The topic of our next episode will be being relevant in our buildings. I hope you will tune in.